So, for my final screencast of the week, I'm going to talk a bit more about my playlist that I gave you guys and then about how the playlists are kind of going to go, just because I figured there could be more information about it, because I kind of just gave you a little blurb on each producer in the playlist. So, my first playlist is the evolution of R&B, and I kind of picked 5 producers that kind of built on each other to lead towards what R&B, kind of just urban music in general, sounds like today. And so I started with Prince, then I went to Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, Timbaland, Pharrell, and the Neptunes, and then finally to Stargate. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about it and play the songs to get you to hear the elements that I wanted you to hear. I don't want to do this every week. I want to talk about it in class a little bit when we come in. But I wanted to talk about this playlist just for clarity's sake, to show you that I kind of built it as a timeline. So I'm going to do different videos that are like, I'm thinking about doing one that's like 80s producers, like how they got that 80s sound, gated reverb and snare, just this, what made the 80s sound like the 80s. I'm going to do some that are like sounds of today. I want to talk about like current hip-hop producers, some of the pop producers that worked in the 2000s, and then I'll talk about like the beginnings of like what we consider a music producer today. So George Martin, Phil Spector from the 60s. So there are going to be a ton of these like evolution and certain era playlists, just so that you get used to listening to different producers and you can recognize the different sounds. I really want you listening to these with a producer's ear. And then I'm also going to do, I've been working on this playlist. I'm not sold on all the tracks yet, but I'm listening to it just so that you guys are listening to more current music and just hearing different styles of music that you might not be listening to. So I started the evolution of R&B playlist with Prince. Now, I definitely could have started it with Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones. I figure I'll probably do another R&B playlist in the future, but Prince and Michael Jackson were both basically equally influential on how R&B and pop really sounds today. So for this playlist's sake, Prince made more sense, but in the future I will kind of give you examples of like Quincy Jones production style. So let's just listen to Little Red Corvette a little bit. Listen to the drum.
I guess I should know by the way you popped your car sideways that it wouldn't last. See, you're the kind of person who believes in making out once, love them and leave them fast. I guess I must be dumb. Share a pocket full of horses, Trojan and some of them used.
Okay, so the drum sounds in this song are big, and they're 80s. Prince produced a lot of his music by himself. He really was a talented artist all the way around. He played a lot of the instruments himself. On his first record, he played every single instrument. He wrote all the songs. He definitely worked with a lot of collaborators, but those collaborators were working with Prince more than Prince was working with his collaborators. And he went through a lot of sets of musicians to kind of change his sound. This sound that he pioneered in the early 80s is the Minneapolis sound, and it is marked by the drum and how it works with the guitar. It's like a funk rock type feel, but it has the synth sounds that became used a ton in the new wave movement in the 80s. And you can hear more of that on I Would Die For You. You hear the big synths. This is an 80s song. It has all the gated snares that I'll talk about more next week.
I'm not too one, I'm not too mad. I am something that you never understand.
Listening to that song, you're not immediately struck, oh, it's R&B. It is and it isn't. I mean, that song has a lot of synths. It's a pop song. It was a hit, but a lot of those elements came back with a more hip hop feel later in the decade with producers like Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who took that Minneapolis sound. They worked in the same circles as Prince. They worked with The Time, which is one of Prince's bands that he used to produce and write for. And they kind of developed this style that later became known as New Jack Swing. And it has those harder drum sounds, even harder, punctuated by more percussive synths. And you can really hear that in the intro to If It Isn't Love by New Edition. So right there, you can hear a lot of the elements that became super commonplace on radio in the late 80s and early 90s. New Jack Swing really brought R&B, pop, and hip-hop all together in a way that continues to resonate today. Just because before that, R&B was kind of its own... It was segregated on racial lines. R&B was black. Pop was white. And with this sound, even though the artists were still mostly black, it was getting play on pop radio. White listeners were listening to this R&B pop blend, and they liked the harder sounds of New Jack Swing. A lot of those sounds later evolved into what we know today. Today, obviously, you won't hear these like super percussive sounds, but there is still an emphasis on percussion in R&B as well as hip-hop. So Miss You Much by Janet Jackson is really almost the initial peak of New Jack Swing, because it was a huge song, huge hit, biggest song of the year, and it has a lot of the same, you can almost hear the same instruments that were in If It Isn't Love in Miss You Much, and I'll skip to the chorus. But you can already start to hear some of the similar instruments.
Say that I'm not. I just know that it feels wrong when I'm away too long. It makes my body hot. So let me tell you, baby. I tell you, mama. I tell you, friends.
See, what's funny about this song is it is so obviously R&B, but right here in Apple Music, where I'm listening to it, it says pop, and it's because the song was so huge, like everywhere in 1989. But those sounds were finally getting accepted as pop music and not as R&B, even though it was R&B music. And this New Jack Swing style continued to develop through the 90s. I skipped a period that kind of was the bridge between New Jack Swing and then the later R&B styles, but Timbaland came onto the scene in the mid-90s, especially with this song, Pony by Genuine. Right there in the intro of that song, you can hear the New Jack Swing influence along with more modern sounding R&B. So the crisp drums are still a focus, but it's not so accentuated that it's immediately reminiscent of the late 80s, early 90s, that era. And Timbaland took these like mouth sounds, like the bass there is just like an edited like kind of like vocal sample, and he kind of ran with that for his career. Cry Me a River is one of the biggest hits that Timbaland ever produced, and its main drum is like a beatbox sample.
You were my urge. You didn't know all the ways I loved you. He took a chance.
So there it has those crisp drums, but they're now like mouth sounds almost, because he's doing the and then the at the end of the measure. And this type of sound, this like crisp drum sound, inspired producers around the same time as Timbaland, like Pharrell Williams, who kind of took that edited New Jack Swing and simplified it even further into this kind of like pop but hip hop realm on songs like Slave for You by Britney Spears.
I know I may be young, but I've got feelings too.
And Hot in Here by Nelly.
No deceiving, nothing up my sleeve, no teasing. I need you to get up on the dance floor. Get that man what he asking for. Cause I feel like busting loose and I feel like touching you.
And this Neptunes sound, the Neptunes is just Pharrell Williams and Chad Hugo. They were a production duo. That defined like the mid 2000s rap scene with, you know, a focus on pop hooks, but then production that still brought rap's message across. Eventually, pop, hip-hop, R&B, I mean, it really, in the late 2000s, especially with the last two songs in this playlist, it really was almost all the same, because Stargate was such an influence on both pop and R&B that the producer started mixing, and you still see that today. Calvin Harris just released an album that was like dance music, but it had a ton of rap and hip-hop features on it. So Stargate, a production duo from Norway, they came with like a pop feel, but they had spent their years in the Scandinavian scene, kind of blending the hip-hop drum sounds like the Neptunes and Timbaland were doing in the late 90s, early aughts, and then combining it with just total pop song structure. So Sick is a pop song, but it has so many R&B elements in it that it's like it's almost a perfect blend of the two genres. And this sound ended up defining probably our generation's most famous pop icon, Rihanna, because she wanted to combine both the pop style so that she could get on the radio, but with like a hip-hop edge. Because Rihanna's image is so central to her music, she needed that mixture of sound. She needed the pop to get on the radio, but she needed the hip-hop to maintain her street cred and to keep her cool. So Rude Boy in 2009 really took Rihanna away from the pop sound that she had and brought her to the sound that still defines her today, which is a blend of pop hooks and kind of hip-hop style. Still crisp drums, like we heard in New Jack Swing.
Come here, rude boy, boy, can you get it up? Come here, rude boy, boy, is you big enough? Take it, yeah, baby, yeah, take it, yeah.
There's almost no verse in this song. It's just hook after hook after hook. The entire song is designed so that you're just singing along to some part of it after you hear it. Either take it, baby, baby, or the come here, rude boy, boy, can you get it up? I mean, in 2009, this song was inescapable. And today, it still sounds like something that would do well on the Billboard charts, on radio, on Spotify, which is now the barometer. So, Anyway, that was just a walkthrough. I know this video is longer than the others, but hopefully that helps you get a sense of what I was trying to showcase in this playlist. And other playlists will be like this in the future.